We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Milo Vassallo, who's the Executive Director of the Media and Democracy Project. And I'm also going to mention that he's a doctor, which, two reasons for mentioning it. I actually, in spite of what I say sometimes, I'm actually very fond of doctors. He's not the first doctor we've had on here. We had Peter Hotez, the great epidemiologist, a month or so back. But the other reason is this is not a full-time job for him, which, I think it's great he takes his time, but this is spare time activity, which I think speaks volumes where we are in terms of getting efforts going in terms of progressive media, or just, let's say, honest media, I'll put it that way. So anyhow, Milo, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Dean, very excited to join you. I admire your work, and an opportunity to talk about my work on your show is definitely something I'm appreciative of. Thank you.
Great. So let me just start with, a very broad question. We've seen enormous changes in the media landscape over the last 3 decades. To my mind, mostly not good, not all but bad, I'll say that, but mostly not good. So let me just ask, what's your take? What do you see as the big developments in the last 3 decades that we should be concerned about, that you've been involved with or monitoring and trying to counter?
Great. Well, there's several kind of roots of how we got here. One of the big ones is technological. I mean, with the advent of the internet, it became possible for people to, number one, get information from various sources. There used to be, ABC, CBS, NBC, your local paper, and maybe a couple national outlets, and that was the common source of shared information for folks. But with the advent of the internet came economic changes that transformed how these news organizations were funded, how they survived. I think people describe this as there have been 3 giant transformations of information in human history. One is the printing press. Another one is the power of the media oligarch, the Pulitzers and folks in the early part of the 20th century who recognized that they could wield incredible power over presidencies and nations by controlling media. And right now we're living through that third one. So it's kind of an intersection of technological and financial means of how news is communicated to people. And a parallel part of all of this is journalism itself. The mechanisms that used to fund it have basically vanished with the advent. All those ad dollars that went into, classifieds. If you were selling a house, you did it in the paper. You're selling a car, you did it in the paper. You were going to, you posted these ads, and that was the revenue source for the Pulitzers and the last great media oligarchs of the 20th century. And with that absence of revenue getting poured into Google and internet companies and direct to consumer marketing through the internet, all these news organizations are scrambling. How do you get people's eyeballs and dollars to support the actual important, civic goal of journalism, to inform the electorate? And so it's this technological change, the funding changes, and those are it's a perfect storm. And it's just kind of hitting us with a collapse of respected, fact-based, reality-based journalism, and then this explosion of digital options in a smorgasbord buffet of limitless possibilities.
One of the things, again, we've talked a little bit about this in the past. I'm sure you follow this even more closely than I do. But if we were to talk about campaign finance reform, we'd have everyone nodding their heads. Everyone knows about Citizens United. They know that, money corrupts elections. So when you have an Elon Musk out there and he spent $300 million, and he's open about it. So he brags about it. He claims he gave the election to Trump. Quite likely true. Several senators. He says this. Again, he has a plausible case. Someone who's analyzed it more closely than I have maybe could determine whether it literally is true, but it's certainly a plausible case. Everyone understands campaign dollars affect elections. But what's amazing to me is that, and again, you raised this already, but there's just so little appreciation that the media, that what people see, people understand that the ads affect how people vote, but you go, doesn't what people see between the ads affect how people vote? It is a little bit incredible.
It is absolutely mind-boggling that there are not more people trying to solve the information crisis in America. There are a few, established civic orgs that have been in this space, like Free Press and others, that kind of create actionable steps, but that you can count on one hand the number of civic orgs that are trying to engage the citizenry in activism around better media. So I've started to adapt this slightly. I can workshop some of kind of how I think about this, but the concept of information diets, 50 years ago, the average American didn't think about their diet. And now you turn on TV and people are talking about alpha omega acids and, fiber and, the concept of an information diet that people haven't really processed, that those are choices they make, the results of policies that they're voting for electeds either have an attention to or mind's eye. So we're at the really very beginning where people understand the concept of what we choose to feed ourselves, what we choose to feed our community, how we spend our media dollars and our attention. Our attention in this economy is almost as important as the dollars we spend. But I think the concept is really in its infancy, that information diets are something that need to be understood and nourished both by policy, but also as individuals.
And, it's striking. And again, the landscape better than I do, but it's, we could easily look at the networks, ABC, NBC, we could see the consolidations there. But this is also very much a state, local level. You've seen just evisceration of local newspapers and, going back, 30 years ago, many small cities of 10, 15, 20,000 people, they had, in some cases, a daily, but if not a daily newspaper, one that came out 2 or 3 times a week. That's gone. And it's not just, I love print, it's not just that, I'm old fashioned, it has to be in print. I just mean literally, it's not there. So you can't go on the web. The paper is not there. Some have gone on the web, and that's fine, because most people do have computers. Not everyone, but most people do have computers. So, okay, so you get it on the web, and that's a problem for those who don't have a computer. But most people can get it. But we've just seen a collapse in the coverage in state and local government in the last 3 decades.
Absolutely. I think it's upwards of a third of journalism jobs are gone in the last 20 years. And this gets back to your point, is how do people, it's so big, people can't see it. Like that how are people going to the polls not knowing a shared set of facts? We used to be able to differ on policy. Should taxes be reserved for this, or should they be for that, or should we cut a tax? Americans don't have a shared base of facts anymore. And there's some data to kind of support this. There's a poll going into the 2024 election asking across the political spectrum a basic shared fact, and you'd appreciate this, was the unemployment rate at a 50-year high? Yes or no? You don't need to have an economics degree. You don't need the finer points of interest rates and recession risk. No, this was going into the 2024 election, asked across the political spectrum by a credible pollster, what were the understanding, yes or no, all-time high, when in fact I know and your audience knows it was a relative 50-year low. So a basic measurable fact, 60% of self-reported Republicans agreed it was at an all-time high. That's a complicated issue. Biden was the incumbent, so maybe there's a bias of they're going to potentially report back a biased impression of the economy. But that 40% of reported Democrats believe that unemployment was at a 50-year high going into the 24 election, to me, accentuates and highlights this problem. That people who should know a basic fact, they generally poll voters about their opinions. Do you think somebody's doing a good job? I'm sure you have a lot to think about polls, but this idea of a shared common fact. And if we don't have facts, that's kind of why the founders thought media was so important, is they knew to have democracy, you needed a shared set of facts. You can have differing heterogeneous opinions, but you needed facts. And that's the catastrophe.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I don't want to get too much into politics at the moment, but it caused me to want to pull what hair I have left out, that when I see President Trump get out there and just say things that are completely at odds with reality. He's been saying prices are going down, and you're going, no, prices are, you could point to a particular good. Gasoline prices are a little bit lower, not hugely lower, but a little bit lower than when he took office, and I'm happy to credit him for that. Prices in general are clearly not going down. We have data on that. We just got The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out their consumer price index. I mean, we got the numbers for September with the shutdown, so who knows, when we'll get numbers again. But in any case, we have that. It's solid data, and anyone who says that they're doctoring it, I'm sorry, they aren't. They're very careful. They're very nonpartisan. There's other sources as well, so it's not. I'm just looking to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but we could say prices are not going down. It's as simple as that. You could say, he's welcome to blame Biden. You could, obviously, there's a lot of things that are outside the president's control. Totally agree with that. But the simple fact of the matter is prices are not going down. And someone who's saying that is just not speaking the truth. Yeah.
So so I see, there's so many parts to this. Like, one of the reasons I particularly drawn to this kind of work as a physician is, like, vaccines are safe and effective and one of the greatest advances of human history. Yet, patient after patient, to challenge that basic, used to be relatively shared fact, except for 0.1% of the population, is the kind of basic shared facts that we're dealing with that have immediate consequence. Understanding unemployment, high, low, important, but I use that as a discrete measurable that pulled, importantly, that's the self-reported Democrat side, having an opposite understanding of a reality, and that's dangerous stuff. So that's that concept of media diets. And as you said, the dearth of local journalism. There are fantastic outlets. I'll plug. I can maybe populate little actions along the way. But we feel so strongly about local journalism is we feel that's something everyone can do. You can find a local outlet. So yes, there are news deserts and reported areas, but actually it's not dead. It's basically been really, they're deserts. So we have built on our website, people can go to it, it's free for everyone, there's a 50-state local journalism directory. It's got 2,200 outlets across the country. There are local owned, we have it broken down by category, but point being is this is how we start giving people power of what can we do. So there's some short-term actions, and one of our actions is find a local outlet where you went to school, where your family still is, and support those journalists, because we need to hold on to those local fact-based reality establishing, affirming local outlets. The whole concept of partisan media is like maybe that's another part of our talk, but like we can all help the outlets that are there by subscribing. Gifting is another thing. I know I'm getting off, but I just feel so there's an opportunity here that it's not dead. It's not quite on life support, but what is there, we absolutely need to nourish and support and praise and engage with.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things on local journalism, because I agree with you 100% on this. First off, we look, I obviously, I'm not in Washington anymore, but I focus national issues. That tends to be where I'm at, where my work is. Local is close to home, to put it crudely. I mean, it's kind of obvious. We want to know if our mayor is giving contracts to his or her buddy, to a relative, and that they're costing way more than they should. We want to know that. How do we know that if we don't have a local newspaper or news site? I don't care if it's paper, but someone that's going down there looking through the contracts, because most of us aren't going to have time to do that. I mean, really, we have lives, so we can't go down and go, oh, who got the contract to build the new road or renovate, the city hall or whatever. We don't have time. So you need to have reporters who could do that and let us know that this is on the up and up. And if it is, great. If it's not, we need to hold them accountable. But if there's no one there doing it, they get away with it. And it costs us a lot of money. The other part of that story, and again, I think this is worth emphasizing, we've had this serious effort, and I think it's been deliberate. I shouldn't say I think. It clearly has been deliberate to undermine the credibility of major media outlets. So we constantly hear fake news, and you're welcome to look at any news source, and you should look at it critically. I mean, I'm not telling none of them are the church. They look at them critically. That's totally appropriate. But poll after poll after poll shows people respect their local media much more so. And to my view, that's both a very strong argument for supporting local media, but it can be contagious. I mean, you support your local news outlet, and they're doing good reporting on City Hall or the state government, and people appreciate that, and they understand. They get used to the idea, okay, they're giving me the real story. I'm getting facts from them. And yeah, I hope that will be contagious. So maybe it'll be the same people, maybe it'll be different people, but you're getting news at the state and local level. Maybe you'll also see, I can get stuff from federal news sources on federal international news that is the facts, that is the real world.
Absolutely. It turns out on a relatively straightforward level, having journalists is actually a nonpartisan thing. Having a newspaper. Every mayor wants somebody to come and report the ribbon ceremony opening the factory that's coming. And so it turns out that we have a little bit of data in the last 5 years that we've been doing this kind of work, is there were a couple national bills to support from with some federal dollars, offset some of the costs of having journalists. And it was about 60-40 in terms of US elected federal officials, congresspersons. It was about 60-40 DR. So this isn't like a supporting journalism and newspapers. All these electeds grew up with newspapers, and people see that there is a problem. But so I just want to highlight that having fact-based reality journalism in the community is locally popular. Sure, corrupt officials are not excited by that, but as you said, but at the end of the day, it's relatively on that level of like, do we need papers? Is it business? Is it a printing press? If we're still doing some print, who's covering the local sports pages? Who's covering high school sports? It turns out it's having support for local news is not really a partisan issue. At the federal level, it definitely is. There's been a willful effort of a fascist movement to undermine people's shared sense of reality. That's kind of at the national level, but there's some hope in there, and that's what we're doing on this call. Is you and I are kind of finding where the nuggets to hold on to, and one of them is having local news and supporting local news is not a hyper partisan issue.
Yeah, in terms of the support, the bipartisan support, and you probably know the details on this better than I do, but I remember in the CARES Act, so the original Relief Act, so this was when Trump was still in the White House, there were two CARES Acts that provided, our $1,200 checks, extended unemployment benefits, expanded unemployment benefits, I should say, extended also, but expanded unemployment benefits, a number of other things just to allow people to get through the period in which many people weren't working. The economy largely shut down. So one of the items that almost got in there was I'm forgetting what they call it, save local journalism provision. That, again, maybe you can give the details because you would know them better than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. That is that. There were two iterations of it. The first one was a little stronger, and it basically was a tax credit for newspapers, news organizations specifically that were under a certain number of employees, and it was basically offset about $35,000 or something along those lines per annum for 5 years, which was basically unfortunately that's what journalists make in this country, but that was basically would subsidize a journalist in some of these rural communities. And there was another important piece as we start kind of making a little list of where there's hope and things to aspire to, is there was a direct, basically tax rebate for folks where they could basically deduct 200, get 250 off their tax returns that they invested in local news. So there was both an organizational outlet support, financial support, and also the concept, and this is besides the economic advantage of inspiring people to maybe write off, subscribe to your local paper, you're going to get 250 back on your taxes if you do it, was also the concept of this media diet that we're really trying to get people to identify. People are paying more attention to what they eat, and do they exercise, and are they stretching, and well, what is my media diet? And then that feeds, well, who's producing my food, and do they have ulterior motives, and how does consolidation, and how did Disney take off Jimmy Kimmel? People start being open to these conversations when they're reading that there's basically large scale factory farms producing a lot of information. And it's not the most nutritious stuff for people to have a good sense of both what's going on locally and nationally.
Yeah, as I recall, there was some bipartisan. I mean, I realized it was led by Democrats, but there were Republicans who supported that. And I don't know, I obviously wasn't there, so I don't know that, this was like a midnight thing where people were throwing things in, pulling them out. And so I don't know exactly what happened to that, but I know there was some bipartisan support.
Yeah, it was. And I'll tell you, so what happened was it was initially not. And then what the Democrat strategy was to try and put a whole bunch of good stuff together and make sure all this good stuff passed at once. And then it became, somewhat. Then I think I don't know. I think it got folded into Build Back Better, or one of the big bills that didn't pass. So it was basically sacrificed. It was very good on its own and had some support, probably not enough to stand on its own yet. And then it was reintroduced in the next Congress without the individual, tax rebate, which I'm bummed about, because that to me was very important to start getting the long game of getting people to think about, oh, I could, honey, should we support the local paper? We're going to get money back anyway. I like their crossword. And but getting people to think about local journalism is a very important, we consider that a pro-democracy concept. And so as people are thinking about democracy and thinking about their community, and so that the second iteration didn't have that was kind of like a bummer, for lack of a better word. And that didn't pass. That didn't get folded into anything and just died in the next term.
Yeah, but it does speak to the fact that you did have widespread support. I mean, a lot of things, there's a line in Washington that no bad idea stays dead for long, and that unfortunately seems to be true. But we should hope occasionally there's some good ideas. but no, I'm being a little cryptic there. But we have a lot of things they didn't pass the first time, long and short, and they eventually did. And let's hope that's one of those. But one of the points, we talked about this before, that this can be done at the state or even local level. So it would be wonderful if we got the federal government, which obviously has the deepest pockets, and they, stood behind this. But you could have a state, you could have a California, you could have a New York, Illinois. I'm just saying these are democratically controlled states. But I mean, if a Republican state would do it, that would be wonderful too. But the point is that this could be done in principle at the state level. So it's not something that we have to wait for, Congress isn't even in session. Who knows when they'll be back? But, we have to wait for them to come back and have a change of heart and then get something that President Trump will sign. That would be ideal, but, we don't have to wait for that.
Definitely. There definitely have been states that are moving different versions of different strategies. There's not going to be one singular solution to this local journalism crisis and the information environment and people's media diets. There's all sorts of opportunities it's wide open. But at the state level is where the most progress has been made. And New York State put together a decent bill that allotted up to $30 million for local outlets. But I think part of this suffers from that the constituency for this type of work is not very vocal or really apparent. So who's the constituency for a local journalism bill? A few news organizations and a few civic orgs that help news organizations. But it's still, so they put, I think, the 3 years, $30 million a year, but they haven't really dispensed much. And unfortunately, the first iteration didn't specifically have an inclusion for nonprofit news, which if anybody should be included. So like electeds are still not getting the guidance, this should be something that's coming from civic orgs and news organizations. And so it's really at its infancy. And as I said, one of the things that we're focusing on is to try and get people who care about democracy, reality-based news, to realize that they can become advocates for these local bills. It's going to be a decade or more before the national level, that's going to be a meaningful effort to build public media and that sort of stuff. So we can't wait. I think that's what you're intimating. And the local stuff in blue states to start should be the model. But there's not enough of a constituency and powers behind even pushing some of these solutions that are out there.
Yeah, and it's, again, we talked about this at the beginning, but it really, if we said campaign financing, there's a lot of people out there who go, yes, I understand that, we have to do something about money in politics. And, that constituency is out there. I'm not disagreeing with them at all. I mean, they're absolutely right. But it's a little bit absurd that you could get all upset that Elon Musk and these other people could throw a fortune into a campaign and tilt its outcome, but you're not concerned that what people are getting in their news is going to tilt the outcome. Again, just the fact that you were talking about earlier. I mean, well, I don't know if I'd ever voted for Donald Trump. If I really thought, Biden was so bad that the unemployment rate was near a record high, I mean, that's a really, really bad thing. And I'm an economist, I would never be that confused about it. I think, because that's my area. Unemployment's horrible, so if I really thought we had like depression levels of unemployment and that the guy sitting in the White House was responsible, I would not vote for that person. I mean, that would be a disaster. So you had a lot of people going to vote who thought up was down, black was white, something 180 degrees at odds with the truth. So Elon Musk can go out there with his commercials or whatever he does to try and affect the vote. But my God, if you got however many people, 40%, whatever the number is, that thinks the complete opposite of reality about the economy, that's a hard thing to overcome.
Absolutely. And if we listen to kind of legacy media, the economy was the issue. So that isn't just like a useful fact to have assessed before the election. That was in effect the most measurable understanding of people's assessment of the economy, which was the number of, I disagree. But point being is that wasn't just some arbitrary metric of an uninformed electorate. That was an uninformed electorate who was going to the polls, and that was perceived as being the issue. So
I'm not sure if it's the exact same poll, but I did see one that was, along these lines. And the people who got the answers correct, and these are right or wrong answers. It's not there's a shade. I mean, it wasn't like, they phrased it so that there was any ambiguity. Unemployment's near a record high, it's near a record low. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. So the people who got it correct overwhelmingly voted for Harris. The people who got it wrong overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Now you could say there are other factors there. The people who voted for Trump might have wanted to believe that the economy was horrible, regardless of what the world was like. They might have wanted to say that. But it was very striking that the people who gave a correct answer, yeah, I know unemployment's actually near a record low, that those people overwhelmingly. So it does indicate there's a relationship between what people understand about the world and how they vote, which again shouldn't really be a controversial position, but just if we want further proof that that seems to be there.
a related subject, if I could. So we've tackled the like how are Americans underinformed, and there's also a giant elephant in the room, which is there's a giant right-wing propaganda information media ecosystem, which not only directly messages its audience and consumers using Fox propaganda as the first example of that, but that ends up influencing corporate media, which isn't truly resistant or firewalled from the impact of that infrastructure. And so that's something that we think a lot about is there is not just reality-based, fact-based journalism that has been really, crushed, and people's media habits are changing with technology, and they're processing social media. And if you're under 30, odds are you haven't read a print paper, and outside of high school, and then, but that's the other part of this. So what Rupert Murdoch pioneered, this idea of building a gigantic brainwashing factory with Fox. Has had a profound, and that is the ultimate example of up is down, down is up. And they did something very specific to something you mentioned, which is they willfully told people don't trust the media. So not trusting the media isn't just a passive process that people are fatigued and they've been listening to kind of a lot of different sources, and they've been told not to believe alternate sources of information. And that has a consequence that the lake is the water's been poisoned, the well has been poisoned intentionally, and that's extra dangerous, and that's kind of accelerated kind of the trust and so these polls come out that trust in media is at a 50-year low. But every time I look at one of those, I'd love to see the quantity of propaganda that's coming out of the right-wing media infrastructure. That's basically the accelerant of the trust in media.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Obviously, they've been very successful. Let me try to go to the optimistic side and make a couple points. One is that, one advantage we do have because of the internet that, wasn't there, say, 30, 40 years ago. We actually do have access directly to a lot of information. Again, I'm being an economist nerd here, but before, if I go back, and actually not that long ago, even not much anymore, but I was for many, many years. If I wanted to get the unemployment data, we literally had someone go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and get a printout of the monthly jobs report because you wouldn't have access to it. It wasn't on the web, so you needed a physical copy, which sounds absurd to people. The fact that you can go on the web. I understand most people aren't going to do this, but some people be interested. They could go on the web and directly go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and get unemployment data. Just the overall unemployment rate, the unemployment rate for Black people, for people with college degrees, for young people. You can get all that directly on the internet. So that's something that wasn't true 3 decades ago. That's true for a whole range of information that you can have direct access. So I mentioned that's a positive. Something we could say that wasn't true. And again, I recognize most people aren't econ nerds, so they're not going to go through that. But the point is, some of us are, And it's much easier for, if you have a friend who's kind of interested in weird stuff, they could go and look on the web and tell you, here's all this information. The other point, again, getting back to the state and local, it doesn't take that much to, support a website. So the idea that, city government could support it, that, you could have a nonprofit collective, that they could support it. And what's, to my mind, really great about that is that they presumably would identify with it. Now I have, we talked about this, I'm stealing, well, I knew Bob McChesney, the great media activist, and he had a proposal, which, again, I strongly endorsed, worked with him on, that would give individual tax credits to support the media outlet of their choice. So you could decide what the sum would be, $100, $150, $200, whatever, you argue over that. But the point would be you would have that money, you could use it to support, your local newspaper, state newspaper, federal, whatever. It would be something that you could put your print on that, here it is, and I'm going to support this news outlet that's going to give me good investigative reporting in Chicago and New York and, some small town. I live in Astoria, Oregon, small city, so wherever it is. And that would be a way to support, in principle, an awful lot of news if you can get that done.
Absolutely. I consider that our moonshot of like where we need to get. And I think the first is really educating people in this concept of becoming advocates for better media. And that's really what my org is trying to do, is to turn people who are like, I think there's a problem. I'm worried about the future of our country, democracy, that amorphous thing is under attack. What can we do? And we literally think about these issues like on a weekly, monthly basis. Like, what are actions, micro actions we can take that, every mountain climb starts with the first step, and building communities. And our goal is to build, and as different states start developing state solutions, and then those state solutions can also be resources for national solutions. But it's going to be a long slog. But the more people recognize that what they are consuming is the consequence of a corporate model for informing this country, which the founders would have been appalled at, and that we as citizens engaged in our communities and in democracy itself need to recognize that democracy activism goes hand in hand. Like knocking on a door of somebody canvassing for a candidate, and if they're upside down, down is up, gravity is not real. Talking policy with that person is not, you're not going to change hearts or minds with that. So we think that like I have this personal fantasy, if I had a magic wand, if I could get every civic org in the country to devote 10% of their proselytizing, their promotional in media, their stuff, not through us, but their own, if they would support and get their communities to support local journalists and independent journalists and little outlets, and make people aware that this is part of advocacy for repro rights, economic justice, and all of these things is media. There's this quote that Bob McChesney got from FCC, borrowed from an FCC commissioner, which is, whatever your area of interest is, without changing the media, progress in your area of interest is far less likely. And that's bottom lining it. And the models, unfortunately, of change in this country have not adapted to the info environment. So consultants will tell people, oh, you need a better message, you should frame it differently. It's, if people aren't hearing that message and all they're hearing are headwinds that are telling the completely different story, I don't care. So I personally, my assessment of the 2024 election, I borrow from a very smart fellow named Matt Sheffield. It was basically the policy platforms versus messaging platforms. Like, you can have the best platform in the world, but if you give me an opportunity and I can own all the messaging platforms or control Twitter and Facebook and algorithms and media and the Washington Post and to some extent the New York Times, I can influence the outcome of the election a lot easier. So that was kind of, I think, one of my personal and our take homes is like the billionaire class and corporate America has recognized consolidation and power are all running through information and control the flow of information. And so it's not a coincidence that, in real time, we are witnessing a new great oligarch media family. The Ellisons at present have in the last year gone from like money from Oracle to now it's CBS News with Barry Weiss to getting rid of the Colbert, an entertainer, and putting their imprint already on the illustrious CBS News. And making moves to potentially one of the major shareholders in an American TikTok, and also potentially Warner Brothers Discovery. So the extraordinarily wealthy in this class recognize that maintenance of and consolidation of that power goes through media and media ownership. And that's like another opportunity we haven't had a chance to talk about, which is regulation. It's like, not only are we thinking, should we be thinking about how do we aspire to and support local better news and a better informed America, but like, where are the regulators here? This is not this is there's a regulatory, I don't even, absence. It's not even like that we are in the wild west of regulation of media.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and we've seen a consolidation that's largely gone unquestioned, even encouraged. And for people not familiar, Barry Weiss, I'm not sure for original claim to fame, she was at the New York Times and made a big point of quitting because she said they were persecuting her as a, I don't know if she considered herself a centrist, conservative, whatever, but she said she was being persecuted. So she made a big point of leaving, and then she started her own outfit. I think she called it the Free Press. Sure, but in any case,
Very confusing.
but made a big point of promoting conservative views. Again, I don't know if she'd agree with that characterization. I would call them conservative, but in any case, certainly not liberal. And she was put in charge of oversight of CBS News. I don't know her exact position there, but basically she's gutting it. I think is probably fair to say. And again, I had plenty of criticism of CBS News, but they did a lot of good reporting. 60 Minutes in particular did a lot of outstanding reporting over the years. I really don't think we can count on that. And, again, the reference to Larry Ellison, of course, I guess it's his kid that bought it up with Oracle dollars, but you also made reference to Discovery and Time Warner. They own CNN. So it's this is a real threat to what we might have thought of as, sort of quality journalism. And again, I'm plenty of bad reporting on CNN. So I'm not, if someone wants to point out to me they did this badly, I've criticized them any number of times, but they tried to be, I'll give them credit for that. I think they generally tried to be honest. Whether they always succeeded or not, another question, but they were committed, I think, to trying to give objective reporting. And I don't think we can count on that being the case going forward.
So yeah, and back, maybe I'd like to hear your thoughts on the regulatory aspects. I mean, nobody knew of the. I mean, there probably 1 in 1,000 Americans knew what the initials FCC stood for until about 6 weeks ago, and now we've gone from 1 in 1,000 to maybe 1 in 100. But still, the FCC is this potentially useful body of regulatory ownership. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I mean, yes, the Federal Communication Commission, which give the full name for people who might not be familiar with the acronym. Yes, it should in principle be a useful source of regulatory pressure to at least limit consolidation and some degree of fairness. But what we've seen, and again, this is new with Trump. I mean, you have the Supreme Court take this, to my view, totally, well, you call it radical or not, it's a radically different view of government that just says the president can override any independent commission. So the Federal Communication Commission was set up to be bipartisan, that people appointed by the president serve fixed terms approved by Congress, and there was a rough partisan balance. So I'm forgetting the number of members. I think it's 5. The president would get to appoint the head of it, but you had people that were career people. They would stay there, in other words. So the president couldn't just say, "You're ugly, you're gone," and you didn't do what I wanted, you're gone. So they were there for fixed terms. If they broke the law, if they did something improper, they could be removed. The Supreme Court said no. President gets to do whatever they want, whenever they want. So that made the FCC, Trump's ball game, and they had the current chair of the FCC, Brendan Carr, openly threatening networks, threatening CBS over getting rid of Steve Colbert, threatening, I guess it was Disney that owns ABC over getting rid of Jimmy Kimmel. Saying, you want, because all of these are huge companies, CBS owned by Paramount and now Ellison's outfit. They have all sorts of regulatory issues that the FCC has direct oversight over. So he made very clear he's going to use his powers to push Donald Trump's political agenda. So that just, that's not what it should be. I don't know how you change that, at least in the current situation. Another regulatory issue that I'll raise, which I do think is very important, is with the Internet, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This goes back to 1996. What this did, I mean, there's a lot in that, so I won't go into everything. But to my view, what I consider important is it exempted a internet platform like Facebook, like X, Twitter X, or TikTok, whatever it might be, for any liability for third party content. And what that means is if someone posts something there or takes out an ad there and it could be defamatory, you could sue whoever took that out. And you might not even know who that is. On Twitter, one of their big people is this guy who is under the name Cat Turd. I don't know who Cat Turd is. I was saying that's a problem because they're anonymous, and someone responded, I know who he is. I go, that's not the point, So if Cat Turd, defames me, calls me a pedophile or whatever he might call me, and he does have millions of followers, I don't even know who the guy is. Maybe I could find him, maybe I can't, but why should I have to? But Elon Musk, there's no liability for that. So Elon Musk can wholesale anyone's defamatory comment and bear no liability whatsoever. Now that contrasts with the law for print and broadcast media. In fact, the very famous Times v. Sullivan case, where the New York Times was sued by someone for carrying an ad. It wasn't an article they ran, they carried an ad. And that was where the Supreme Court said, well, there has to be a higher standard for defaming a public official. The case is more complicated. I won't go into everything, but that was the takeaway. But the point was the Times was being held liable for third-party content. If the exact same thing happened with Elon Musk's site, Elon Musk just goes, Section 230, I'm out of the picture. So, to my view, that's a real problem. And the silly argument that people make on the other side is, oh, Elon Musk can't possibly monitor the hundreds of millions of posts that go up every day. I don't know what the number is, but I'm sure it's something like that. That's true. But what you do, take something from another law they passed. You have takedown notices. So with copyright, so if someone stole one of my articles and they're putting out under their name or whatever, I can sue Elon Musk for copyright violation. I send him a note saying, I wrote this piece. You have to take it down right away. And if he doesn't do it, then he could be sued. I could sue him for copyright, not just the person who posted it, but I can sue Elon Musk. Do the exact same thing with defamation in Section 230. That if Cat Turd puts something up that I did this, I did that, and I go, no, I didn't. I sent Elon Musk, I didn't do it. I could show that I didn't do it. This is a lie. I want you to take it down. If he doesn't do it, he's liable, not just Cat Turd. I think that would be something very much worth doing.
I'm not versed in the area of 230, so I'm going to step aside on that one. It's great to hear, but these are solutions. It's great to hear, a thoughtful person's kind of perspective of, like, clearly what we're doing now is not sustainable. You cannot have a model where people can do, we don't want, obviously, as we're heading into some fascist headwinds, it is a truism, be careful of what we want government regulation to be or not be. But, I do think some of the standards of breaking up giant corporations, and this is your sweet spot. But, right now there's a merger of Nexstar, the number one controller conglomerate of local TV stations, and it's in process of merging with number 4. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I know that's not good for competition, which is not good for business. And now that we see these are actually partisan organizations, as we saw with them, that the market cap of Nexstar is like $9 billion, and it's in Tegna is like $1 billion. This is a $10 billion company, but they control the pipes, which made Disney's knees buckle over part of the reasons that they buckled on Jimmy Kimmel. So this infrastructure, when it has a partisan angle, becomes to the forefront, and you can really see that there are fewer pipes and fewer control checkpoints can be weaponized very quickly.
Let me just mention with my Section 230 diatribe, I didn't see my change as being increasing government regulation. Quite the opposite. It's just saying that same sort of defamation laws would apply to the web as applied to newspapers and broadcasts. But let's try to end on an optimistic note. A lot of bad news we could point to, but what do you see? I mean, you mentioned efforts to spur local news coverage. What's your spiel? What's the cause for optimism here? Why should we not throw in the towel and accept that we're going to have fascism?
Well, a couple of things. You started with this idea that there are technological changes that you can now get statistics that you couldn't have had. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm old enough that I was a huge baseball fan in high school and I played Stratomatic baseball, and I would go to Major League Baseball headquarters in New York City and get this little binder that had the stats of anybody who had an at bat or threw one pitch in the major league, and I had to go down to the office to get them. So, at any event, the point being is some of those the technological changes are not done. We're in an evolution, this giant epochal kind of transformation of how people are learning about the world and subject to influence of oligarchs and right-wing disinformation. I consider Blue Sky a positive example, a somewhat federated alternate way that humans can communicate. I mean, people can gripe about it. I think it's absolutely a fantastic alternative for people who want to do these small microblogging without propaganda at scale and an algorithm. And to me, it gives me hope, whether Blue Sky is the solution or not, but people are working on these federated solutions of how we communicate and share. So Blue Sky gives me hope. I think that people are recognizing that we need to do more about supporting journalists and journalism. They're independent journalists going to other platforms. I'm not a giant supporter of Substack specifically. That's the more familiar name. That's got issues too. It's got some Mark Andreessen funding to it. But point being is people are beginning to recognize, hey, I really like what this person's doing. I'm going to spend $7 a month and get their newsletter a couple times a week. You have people like Timothy Snyder and Ruth Ben-Ghiat and these historians who are like, meeting the moment and helping people get context so that people can now access really primary sources of both journalism. There are incredible smaller orgs, a lot of these tech news organizations that are doing a great job, Tech Dirt, 404 Media, The Verge, ProPublica. But what our goal is in the Media and Democracy Project is to get people who are concerned about this stuff and to get off the blocks and actually subscribe to ProPublica, to subscribe to some of these outlets and build your own modern 2025 information diet that supports your understanding of the world and supports democracy and is not controlled by one of these either corporate or oligarch kind of compromised platforms. I personally find the Associated Press. In the last year, have learned about the Associated Press. They have basically a direct-to-consumer source of information. They're not perfect. They wrote a horrible thing on repro rights this weekend, but they are a nonprofit, and they have a public editor. They have like the infrastructure of doing incredible journalism across the country. I personally consider them a perfect solution for people who ask me what I think of. I don't think the New York Times is meeting the moment in terms of communicating the threats to democracy. But people want to know what happened when a plane flips over or what's going on in Manila. Associated Press is fantastic. So that gives me hope, as there is global national news source out there. There are these great national organizations put with great journalists. There's some solo journalists doing good work and and people are beginning to recognize that they vote with their wallets on a personal level. So those are some of the things that give me hope.
Yeah. No, that's good to hear. And I agree with you 100%, Associated Press. And also, again, I'll second, third, fourth, ProPublica. They've done lots of great work. So, people should look them up if you like them, subscribe to them because they obviously need support. But definitely, there is good stuff being done. So, a lot of bad things to worry about, but there definitely is some grounds for hope. So, Milo, is there, anything in particular that you want to take away that you want people to have, as they watch this and what they could do, what we could think about going forward?
Absolutely. First and foremost is to become activated. Is recognize that we individually have much more power than we realize. We can improve our own media diets. We can make healthy choices, support local news, support independent news, support these amazing outlets that are doing good work and sharing them. I tell our community that we're pollinators of good information. And we can also nourish our communities and our family and friends, as opposed to sending that same article that folks are circulating from the New York Times. How about sending things around from local outlets or specifically some of these nonprofit orgs? And also another way that some folks are getting involved is there's something called citizens journalism. There's actually, if people want to get involved in not just consuming, but producing information. Democracy depends on us all playing different roles besides voting. There's something called citizens journalism where people get some training. They go to city halls and cover basic city. As we talked earlier, Dean, there's no beat covering City Hall in a news desert. Nobody's covering City Hall. And so, for example, in Chicago, there's something called City Bureau. One of the more established that's on my radar screen of orgs that takes people in the community, gives them skill sets, pairs them with journalists, and empowers them to go to board meetings and city council meetings or local community board meetings and collect information that would be useful and turnkey that to their communities. So I think that's a really cool model.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, that's a great thing for people to lead with. And also, again, picking up, being an older person myself, we have a lot of people, retirees, near retirees or semi-retirees that have some time, and they would like to, they have developed skills in their working lives. And this is a great thing for them to do. They go down to City Hall, whether it's once a week, every other week, whatever it might be, and post what they see, what they think's important. And if for whatever reason they're busy one week, they don't make it. So what? You apologize and you come back the next week. So this is a great thing that people can do, and a great way to get involved.
Absolutely. And now we're in this era of cell phones. It turns out that people, we can see it with ICE. We can see people documenting reality with the power of their smartphone. And I think the power of that is to share it, not just on socials, but potentially reach out to journalists. One of our mantras in the Media March Project is we see journalists as accountable allies in our democracy. And if you see something, you record it, share it with a local journalist. And that's an opportunity to kind of be part of the community's kind of watch ears and eyes of what's happening. And so we're excited about that concept of people getting engaged in capturing reality, supporting reality-based, fact-based news, and getting involved in media activism, media reform. And yes, I mean, this idea of becoming a citizen journalist with some support and getting some skills and being a part of the community that's turnkeying useful information is definitely something to aspire to.
I'll just say one more thing, I'm keeping you too long here, but the coverage of ICE, the citizen journalism, has been hugely important because it went in, we know in the election, this is a winning issue for Donald Trump. He's going to, deport the rapists and the murderers, which was never an issue because they were always being deported insofar as they were found. So that was never the issue. But when you had people with their cell phones going out there showing, no, it's not rapists, murderers, it's school kids. It's people working in food trucks. It's gardeners. That's who they're beating up and sending off to wherever, prisons in El Salvador. When people see that, they don't think that's a good idea. And it's no longer a good issue for Donald Trump. And that was citizen journalism. So it makes a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the more striking images is, there aren't enough journalists to capture all that's going on. And for, I think, some of these communities that have formed watchdog groups and almost forming little media, they probably already have, but as people form these community, watchdog groups, is recognizing that media is important. I mean, for me, there's some striking images of the last several months. There's this priest in his collar, and he got pepper balled in the head, and you see this cloud of dust. I mean, without that random person in their cell phone, I would never have seen that jarring image. That jarring image ended up going around the world as being the reality of what's happening. And if I could end with a little, I do think, unfortunately, we are heading towards a fascist America. And I think that's the context of the conversation we're having. And I think reality is really kryptonite to a fascist agenda, and seeing the human consequences, the realities of what is happening, what isn't happening. And I think the news and journalists are our heroes, and supporting them in any way we can is part of that fight for our aspirational democracy and again.
Great. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you. Pleasure.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.